Blanchardstown in the late 1990s was far from just suburban tranquility. In the shadow of new shopping centres and housing estates, a group of young criminals began to make a name for themselves on the streets. They were dubbed the Westies by Irish media, named after their stronghold in West Dublin's Blanchardstown suburb. What started as a ragtag crew of joyriders and petty thieves from areas like Corduff, Mulhudart and Clonsilla would soon evolve into one of Dublin's most feared drug gangs. By the end of the decade, the Westies had muscled their way to dominance over the local heroin trade, exploiting the boom times of the Celtic Tiger when cash and cocaine flowed freely. In these early days, the gang's core members were barely out of their teens. Childhood pals from the area, like Jason O'Connor and David Goulding, cut their teeth stealing cars and causing mayhem on estate roads. They, and many others, fell under the sway of Shane Coates and Stephen Sugg, the ambitious young men at the helm of the Westies. Coates, the elder statesman in his 20s, was tough and street-smart, while Stephen Sugg, backed up by his loyal younger brother Bernard, was equally ruthless. Together, Coates and Sugg offered the local petty criminals a chance to level up, join the Westies' enterprise and get rich off the drug boom, or stand in their way and suffer the consequences. It was an enticing offer in a place where some kids dropped out of school by age 11 and saw gangsters driving flashy cars as role models. The rise to power was fast and ferocious. As Dublin's economy grew, so did the drug market. The Westies capitalized on exploding demand for heroin and the newfound popularity of cocaine among Ireland's affluent middle class. By the early 2000s, this crew was reportedly pulling in tens of thousands of euro a week, flooding West Dublin's streets with narcotics. With profits soaring, the gang expanded its activities, from armed robberies to extortion rackets, anything that could fill their pockets. But it wasn't just the money that made them infamous, it was the violence. The Westies earned a bloody reputation almost immediately for their willingness to do whatever it took to secure their turf. At the center of the Westies' story are a few key figures whose names became synonymous with terror in Dublin. Shane Coates, often regarded as the Westies' de facto leader, Coates was a Blanchardstown native in his late 20s who had risen through the ranks of local crime. Cold-headed and calculating, he acted as the gang's chief enforcer and shot-caller. Gardaí sources say Coates ordered and in many cases personally carried out some of the most appalling acts of violence imaginable. He was the kind of gang boss who would shoot first and not bother asking questions later. Coates had a charismatically menacing presence. Even among hardened criminals, he was considered one of the most dangerous men on the streets. Stephen Dougie Sugg, co-leader of the Westies alongside Coates, Stephen Sugg was every bit as vicious. In his mid-20s, Sugg brought along his younger brother Bernard Verb Sugg as muscle. Bernard earned the nickname Verb for his motor mouth and swagger, but he was best known for his brutality. He served as an enforcer for the gang, essentially Coates and Stephen's right-hand thug. By all accounts, Bernard was a violent psychopath and a bully, the kind of heavy who thought nothing of pistol-whipping a rival or terrorizing a vulnerable drug user. Together, the Sugg brothers and Coates formed a triumvirate at the top of the Westies, forging a bond in blood and crime. Andrew and Mark Glennon. These two brothers were originally trusted lieutenants in the Westies' ranks. Andrew Madser Glennon, around 30, and his older brother Mark, early 30s, provided extra muscle and helped run the day-to-day drug dealing on the estates. For several years, the Glennons were key enforcers who carried out orders and kept the cash flowing. However, their loyalty would not last forever. The Glennon brothers had ambitions of their own, and their split from the gang would later become a turning point in the Westies saga. Alan Fatpuss Bradley. Though not a member of the Westies' inner circle, Alan Bradley was a contemporary gangland figure whose name loomed large in West Dublin. Based out of nearby Finglas, Bradley led his own criminal outfit and was a major player in armed robberies and drug trafficking across the west and north of the city. Stocky and intimidating, hence the nickname Fatpuss, Alan Bradley moved in the same circles of violence and greed. He and his brother Wayne controlled territory not far from the Westies' turf and were feared locally. As the Westies rose and fell, Bradley was one of those waiting in the wings, an opportunist ready to swoop in on any power vacuum. His path would cross indirectly with the Westies as the battle for Dublin's underworld intensified. These were the main characters in a gangland drama that would grip Dublin. Coates and the Suggs as the ruthless leaders, the Glennons as allies turned rivals, and predators like Fatpuss Bradley hovering at the edges. Each would play a role in the violent saga that unfolded in the early 2000s. For about 5 years, from the late 1990s into the early 2000s, the Westies ruled West Dublin through fear. They didn't just sell heroin, they owned the trade, controlling most of the supply that poured into estates from Blanchardstown to Clonsea. They also dabbled in cocaine, capitalizing on the era's coke boom, and in classic gangster fashion, they shook down local businesses for protection money and knocked off cash-in-transit vans when the opportunities arose. What truly set the Westies apart was their extreme brutality. Even by Gangland standards, this crew's methods were shocking. They enforced their rule with kidnappings, kneecappings, and savage beatings. Drug addicts who owed as little as $10 were not spared. The Westies would drag defaulters into back alleys or abandoned lots and dish out horrifying punishment beatings over pocket change. One report noted that for debts as low as €10, the gang would terrorize the area, dishing out punishment beatings. To make an example, they seemed to revel in intimidation tactics. Kneecapping, shooting a victim through the knee to cripple them, was a favored warning shot. Slashing with blades was another. The gang had a reputation for slicing people up with carpet knives, leaving victims with permanent scars. In one particularly cruel incident, Westies thugs even assaulted a man in a wheelchair. To them, nothing was off limits if it maintained their iron grip on the territory. Extreme violence was practically the gang's calling card. Directed both at rival dealers and their own addicted customers, local residents lived in constant fear. The estates of Corduff and Mulhudart became the Westies' stomping grounds, and the gang acted like warlords. Witnesses to their crimes were terrified into silence. In fact, Gardaí later remarked that despite numerous operations against the Westies, no one has ever testified against the leaders. Such is the notoriety of the gang. Intimidation was working. People knew that crossing the Westies or speaking to police could mean a bullet or a beating. A Garda source at the time summed it up bleakly. There would be a fear of retaliation. People are terrified. Even other seasoned criminals were wary of the Westies. They were earning a reputation as Ireland's most feared young gang. Untouchable villains who thought nothing of executing an enemy in broad daylight. Inevitably, the Westies' violent rise put them on a collision course with other underworld figures. The drug trade is never peaceful, and soon the gang was embroiled in vicious feuds, some against outside rivals and others within their own ranks. By 2002-2003, two major conflicts were brewing that would seal the Westies' fate. The Westies' first big war ignited over a drug deal gone sour. They had once partnered with a gang from the south side of Dublin, often referred to as the Crumlin Gang, to share drug supply lines. But greed and mistrust corroded the alliance. In April 2003, a North Dublin drug dealer named Paul Ryan, who had connections to the Westies' business, was found murdered execution-style in County Offaly. Gardaí suspected the Westies were behind Ryan's killing, possibly as a message to their wavering associates. This act poured gasoline on an already tense relationship with their Dublin rivals. Soon after, the Crumlin Gang, led by rival kingpins from South Inner City, struck back. They allegedly targeted the Westies' leadership in retaliation, sparking a tit-for-tat cycle of violence. By mid-2003, West Dublin was bracing for an all-out gang war between the Westies and a coalition of enemies from Clonsilla, Crumlin, and beyond. Armed detectives warned that any spark could set off an explosion of violence. If they are both back, they are preparing for revenge, one local source said of the Westies' bosses, noting that people are terrified of what might come next. At the same time, a betrayal was brewing inside the gang. The Glennon brothers, Andrew and Mark, had grown dissatisfied with their cut of the profits. They felt Coates and Sugg were keeping too large a slice of the pie. In 2003, the Glennons decided to break away from their mentors. Sensing opportunity, they secretly joined forces with a North Dublin crime outfit, an alliance that reportedly included a notorious drug trafficker named David Babyface Lindsay from Coolock. This defection split the Westies into factions. On one side, Coates and the Sugg brothers. On the other, the Glennons backed by new powerful friends. The bad blood was immediate and intense. What had been a single gang now became two rival gangs vying for control of West Dublin's drug turf. Late summer 2003 turned into open season, with the Westies' kingpins, Coates and Stephen Sugg suddenly out of the country. More on that soon. The Glennon faction saw its chance to seize power. But first, they needed to eliminate the Westies' lieutenant still on the ground. Bernard Verb Sugg. Bernard was Stephen's younger brother and the acting boss in Blanchardstown, while Coates and Stephen hid abroad. The Glennons knew that as long as Verb was alive, he'd be a rallying point for Westies loyalists, so they made a plan to take him out. On the night of August 18, 2003, Bernard Sugg was having a pint at the Brookwood Inn, a busy pub on Blackcourt Road in Corduff, a local haunt that doubled as the Westies' unofficial headquarters. Around 10:30 p.m., two masked gunmen barged through the door. They knew exactly who they were looking for and even knew where he liked to sit. The gang's crew had a regular table inside the entrance. As soon as Verb spotted the men with balaclavas and guns, he bolted for the exit. It was too late. In the panic, one attacker leveled a handgun and shot Bernard Sugg twice in the chest before he could escape. Patrons dove for cover, drinks went flying, and the pub erupted in screams. One innocent bystander caught a stray bullet in the foot. Amid the chaos, the gunmen showed no concern for human life as they pumped 6 shots into the crowded bar. Bernard Verb Sugg, aged 23, collapsed on the floor mortally wounded. He was rushed to a hospital but died within the hour. The hit on Sugg achieved its objective. The Glennon brothers had removed Coates and Sugg's last loyal lieutenant in Dublin. In the power vacuum that followed, the Glennon faction took control of the drug trade in West Dublin. As one account noted grimly, for a brief moment, Andrew and Mark Glennon reigned supreme over the very territories they once enforced for Coates. But their triumph would be short-lived. The underworld is fickle, and yesterday's allies can become tomorrow's executioners. By 2004, West Dublin's Gangland was in turmoil. The original Westies leadership was in hiding abroad. Their protege-turned-traitors, the Glennons, were now the top dogs at home, and the feud with the Southside gang was still smouldering in the background. Gun violence skyrocketed. Blanchardstown turned into a war zone of reprisals and hits. As one Irish reporter described at the time, northwest Dublin's violent underbelly was threatening to erupt. Armed Garda units patrolled housing estates in anticipation of the next attack. Ordinary people hunkered down, praying not to get caught in the crossfire. Even as chaos reigned in Dublin, the original Westies bosses were plotting their comeback from afar. In mid-2003, Shane Coates and Stephen Sugg fled Ireland to escape intense Garda heat. The catalyst was a dramatic shootout with the Gardaí that spring. In May 2003, Coates and some gang members were surprised by police while hiding out at a rural farmhouse in County Cavan, near the village of Virginia. The Westies had been using the isolated house as a stash pad for weapons and stolen goods. When officers arrived to investigate a tip about a burglary, Coates and his crew opened fire. A wild gun battle ensued in the quiet countryside. Coates was wounded in the exchange, but managed to slip away in the chaos. He knew the net was closing in. The Gardaí were hot on his trail after that narrow escape. Rather than stick around for certain arrest or face retribution from the rival gangs in Dublin, Coates and Stephen Sugg decided to vanish. They first surfaced in Northern Ireland, then made their way to Spain by late 2003. For gangsters on the run, the sunny costas of Spain had become a popular refuge. Coates and Sugg set themselves up around Alicante on the Costa Blanca, a place where many Irish expats and fugitives mingled under the radar. With pockets full of cash, the Westies leaders started living the high life. One report claimed they even invested in local businesses, with one of them owning 2 pubs and a restaurant in the Alicante area. But they weren't simply retiring to sip sangria on the beach. Coates and Sugg were looking to continue their drug enterprise from abroad. Southern Spain offered new opportunities. Large-scale shipments of cocaine and cannabis flowed through the Iberian Peninsula, and plenty of Irish and British gangs were active there. The Westies duo saw a chance to get in on the action, possibly to organize supply lines back to Ireland or to muscle in on the expat drug scene. However, entering an established foreign underworld was a dangerous game. Coates and Sugg brought their Dublin intimidation tactics to Spain, and that didn't sit well with the competition. They were essentially trespassers on someone else's turf. Spanish police later concluded that Coates and Sugg tried to muscle in on the local crime scene, using the same bully boy methods that had served them so well in West Dublin. The pair threw their weight around the Alicante underworld, attempting to take over drug operations run by other gangs. In doing so, they signed their own death warrants. In January 2004, just months after arriving in Spain, Shane Coates and Stephen Sugg vanished without a trace. Back in Dublin, underworld rumors swirled that the Westies bosses had been kidnapped or assassinated. Initially, even the Garda weren't sure what to believe. Some speculated it was an elaborate hoax, that Coates and Sugg had faked their own abductions to lay low and take the heat off while plotting revenge on their enemies. One detective quipped darkly that this mysterious disappearance was the Spanish job, hinting it might be a con job rather than a real murder. Garda intelligence knew the Westies had plenty of enemies. Was it a rival Irish gang in Spain? The Russian mafia? Colombian cartels? At first, these were only whispers and unconfirmed reports. Months turned into years with no sign of Coates or Sugg. Their families reported them missing. Garda quietly liaised with Europol and the Spanish Civil Guard to investigate, but there was no hard evidence of what happened. In Dublin, however, the underworld had a grim understanding. The Westies leaders had likely been betrayed and executed on Spanish soil. It wasn't until July 2006 that the truth was confirmed in the most macabre way. That summer, acting on a tip-off from an Irish informant, Spanish police unearthed a makeshift grave beneath a warehouse in the town of Cartel, near Alicante. Inside a pit under 6 feet of concrete lay 2 skeletal bodies. DNA tests later confirmed what many suspected. They were the remains of Shane Coates, 31, and Stephen Sugg, 27. The Westies kingpins had been shot in the head at close range, their bodies dumped and covered over with cement. Spanish investigators described the scene. The men had been likely lured to that warehouse, overwhelmed by attackers, tied up and summarily executed. A police spokesman in Alicante noted the brutality, saying the victims were each shot in the head and left in a shallow grave, mostly bones, by the time they were found. It was the ultimate betrayal. Coates and Sugg thought they were attending a friendly meeting, perhaps to broker a massive drug deal. In fact, a trap had been set. According to local reports, a rival Irish gang operating in Spain, allegedly one that had merged with former paramilitary members, arranged a phony drug transaction to lure the Westies in. The prize dangled in front of them was huge, a 200-kilogram cache of cannabis to be split or bought. Greed led Coates and Sugg right into the ambush. Once isolated in the warehouse, they were outnumbered and outgunned. The rival gang, likely Dublin criminals who had established themselves on the Costa Blanca, overpowered the Westies, tied them up, and shot them dead. Their bodies were unceremoniously dumped in a pre-dug pit and entombed in concrete under the warehouse floor. In Gangland fashion, the hitmen buried the evidence of the crime, literally building over it. Coates and Sugg disappeared off the face of the earth, leaving friends and foes alike to speculate for years. The discovery of their remains in 2006 made international headlines. Ireland's most wanted gang bosses had met a violent end abroad. Spanish and Irish authorities finally had closure on the case. The Westies leaders had been betrayed and executed by a rival Irish mob, likely as payback for their attempt to take over operations in Spain. As one Garda source put it, they won't find anything unless he is actually dead and his body is found. And now bodies had indeed been found. It was the dramatic climax to the Westies story, but the bloodletting wasn't over yet. Back in Dublin, even before Coates and Sugg's fates were known, the Westies gang was unraveling. Bernard Sugg was dead, killed in 2003. Coates and Stephen Sugg were missing, presumed hiding or dead by 2004. That left the Glennon brothers as the last men standing in the Westies' power structure. After Bernard's murder, the Glennons and their new allies, like babyface Lindsay, took over West Dublin's drug business. They enjoyed about a year or so at the top of the heap, but as often happens in gangland, victory quickly gave way to infighting. By 2005, cracks formed between the Glennon brothers and the very partners from North Dublin, who had helped them seize control. Greed, mistrust, or a deal gone bad, whatever the cause, the Glennons became embroiled in a dispute with their new crime partners. The alliance that overthrew the Westies leaders fell apart, and another deadly feud was sparked. The payback came swift and lethal. In April 2005, Andrew Madsa Glennon, 30, was ambushed and shot dead near his home in Clonee, on the border of West Dublin. Sources say at least 4 gunmen took part in the well-planned hit, a sign that powerful enemies wanted Glennon eliminated. Just 5 months later, in September 2005, his brother Mark Glennon, 32, was gunned down outside his house in Blanchardstown by a lone assassin. In the span of a year, the traitors who had once betrayed the Westies were themselves wiped out. In 2005, the 2 Glennon men were murdered. after they became embroiled in a dispute with their new crime partners. One account dryly noted, "Gangland Dublin had come full circle. Every major player from the Westies saga was now either dead or disappeared. It was an extraordinary wipeout. Between 2003 and 2005, 5 key members of the Westies, Shane Coates, Stephen Sugg, Bernard Verb Sugg, and Mark and Andrew Glennon, were all killed." As the Irish Times later summarised, the collective referred to by the media as the Westies are long gone. Almost every one of them is dead. The gang that had once terrified Blanchardstown effectively imploded, brought down by its own violent ethos and the swords of its enemies. The few who weren't dead were behind bars or in hiding. One Garda operation after another had targeted the Westies and their affiliates. By mid-2000s, the authorities, along with rival gunmen, had effectively dismantled the Westies network. Even as the blood was drying on the pavement, the Gardaí continued to round up the remnants. Police had been relentless in pursuing the gang's activities, from the shootout in Cavan to surveillance on known members back in Dublin. Surveillance operations, drug busts, and the Criminal Assets Bureau, CAB, all played roles in squeezing the gang. Notably, Alan Fatpuss Bradley, operating in the same sphere, was hit with a hefty $750,000 tax demand by KB for his ill-gotten gains, which gives a sense of the money sloshing around. In one dramatic episode in 2011, years after the Westies' collapse, Gardaí got wind that some younger criminals were invoking the Westies' name and trying to reform the gang. This new Westies plot involved a scheme to kidnap a bank worker as part of a robbery, a classic tactic in Dublin's underworld. However, a Garda swoop foiled the revival before it could take off. The police arrested the conspirators and made it clear that the Westies brand would not be making a comeback on their watch. The fearsome gang was history, its surviving members scattered. When the dust settled by the late 2000s, West Dublin's underworld had been irrevocably altered. The Westies were gone, but the drug market they once dominated did not simply disappear. Instead, a power vacuum opened up and many were eager to fill it. For a time, chaos reigned as different factions scrambled for pieces of the Westies' former turf. The feud between Jason J. O'Connor and David Gully Goulding, 2 one-time Westies associates who had grown up stealing cars together, is one small example. These childhood friends turned bitter enemies after the gang's disintegration, with each blaming the other for past betrayals. Their personal war led to further bloodshed in the years after, showing how the ripple effects of the Westies saga continued on local streets. Bigger fish, meanwhile, swam in to claim dominance. In the nearby neighbourhood of Finglas, a veteran gangster, Martin Marlowe Hyland, had been running one of Ireland's largest drug operations in parallel to the Westies' reign. After Hyland was assassinated in late 2006, ironically by his own crew, figures like Alan Fatpuss Bradley stepped into the vacuum. Bradley's Finglas crew and others from North Dublin started taking over the armed robbery and drug rackets that the Westies and Hyland had once controlled. As of the late 2000s, 3 main factions were jostling for supremacy in northwest Dublin's crime world. One led by Fatpuss Bradley, another by a returning armed robber, and a third by an up-and-coming gangster from Finglas's Kippure area. Gangland abhors a vacuum, and the fall of one gang simply meant opportunity for the next. The names and faces changed, but the brutal business continued. On a broader scale, the void left by the Westies was eventually filled by more structured and internationally connected cartels. The late 2000s saw the rise of the Kinahan cartel, a Dublin crime family that expanded into a global drug empire. They, along with other gangs, absorbed much of the Irish drug trade. The chaotic days of the Westies gave way to a more corporate style of organized crime. Yet for all their power, even the big cartels learned lessons from the Westies saga. They saw how internal feuds and reckless violence could bring a gang down in a hail of bullets. In West Dublin communities, the legacy of the Westies is a cautionary tale etched in blood. Older residents still remember the era when the gang's name was enough to make people double-lock their doors at night. The very word Westies became synonymous with savage violence. As one Irish crime reporter noted, the Westies were among the most dangerous of Dublin's organised crime gangs, a mob that dominated the local heroin trade and still operate, even as younger gangs came up behind them. Their story has been recounted in books and documentaries as an example of how quickly a gang can rise and how violently it can fall. Today, West Dublin's streets are quieter than during the Westies' heyday. But the scars remain. Virtually an entire generation of gangland figures from that time is either dead or serving long prison terms. The Westies, in particular, were wiped out so thoroughly that there was hardly anyone left to carry their flag. A 2014 analysis observed that of the gang leaders who made headlines in the early 2000s, almost all are now dead or in jail, with the Westies being the prime example. The void they left was filled, but not by a single successor. Instead, many smaller fires started where one big fire burned out. If there is any silver lining to their demise, it's that the extreme lawlessness they instilled in Blanchardstown was curbed, at least for a while, by their removal. The Gardaí's crackdown and the gang's self-destruction brought a measure of relief to residents who had lived in fear. As of the mid-2010s, Blanchardstown's gang feuds cooled compared to the Westies era, though new threats always loom on Dublin's crime landscape. Conclusion: a violent chapter in Dublin's underworld. The story of the Westies plays out like a tragic gangster film, except it was all too real. It began with impoverished kids in Dublin's West End looking for kicks and cash, and it ended with those same young men buried in concrete or riddled with bullets. In the span of a few years, Shane Coates and Stephen Sugg built a drug empire on fear, became kings of their domain, and then lost everything. Their gang's meteoric rise was fueled by Ireland's booming economy and insatiable hunger for drugs, while their downfall was fueled by betrayal, vengeance, and an overdose of their own violent medicine. What makes the Westies saga so compelling is its raw, unflinching brutality. This was not a crew interested in subtlety or negotiation. They ruled by the gun and the knife. They kneecapped addicts, abducted rivals, and left bodies in their wake as readily in Dublin as their killers later did to them in Spain. As one Spanish police lieutenant remarked after their bodies were found, the Westies were Dublin's most notorious drug gang, and they met a suitably notorious end. The image of Coates and Sugg's decomposed remains under a warehouse floor is a haunting reminder of where the path of violent crime leads. In the annals of Irish crime, the Westies' reign in the late 1990s and early 2000s stands out for its savagery and its rapid collapse. They were a product of their environment, born into poverty and chaos, but they also created an environment of even greater chaos for their community. The gang's story has been recounted in newspapers, books, and even by word of mouth on Dublin's streets, ensuring their infamy lives on, even if they do not. Perhaps the ultimate legacy of the Westies is a lesson to the gangs that followed. Live by the gun, die by the gun. In the words of one Irish detective reflecting on that era, the Westies are long gone, almost every one of them is dead. Their tale remains a dark chapter in Dublin's underworld history, a blood-soaked saga of power, betrayal, and ruthless crime that will not soon be forgotten by those who lived through it.